Hello, Internet, and welcome to another Wednesday's serial. It is I, your host, Bartholomew, and I'm going to talk some kamiks. But before we get into that, oh my god, this lighting makes it look like I have no chin. Just, oh, so sorry about that. Just, listen, put a picture of a cute kitty over me or something. That sounds weird. So I have started on a bit of a comic journey. I started reading the Miles Morales Spider-Man stuff, which took me long enough, right? But it's interesting in aggregate. It it's definitely important to note that like when he started, he was set in the Ultimate Universe versus every little bit I have read of him so far, which was like Spider-Man or like Spider-Verse stuff, right? That was always in the greater context of the Spider-Man mythos, whereas this was coming purely off of the Ultimate Spider-Man. And man, you can really get a sense that there was some closer interplay that actually makes Miles seem more unique now that the Ultimate Spider-Man's kind of more in the past, and some details have kind of slid from the popular conscious, I'd say. For instance, J. Jonah Jameson, when dealing with Miles Morales, has this humility and this adult responsibility that is not the character in pretty much any other iteration, because he learned his lesson when, actually a bit before Peter Parker died. There was kind of some time where he had some self-reflection about it, and it was telling, and it was actually one of the more interesting arcs within the Ultimate side of the Spider-Man things. There's a lot more play with Spider-Woman and Spider-Man being deferent to the Avengers, whereas that was a big part of the Ultimate Spider-Man before him. This one immediately snaps to that. They already have a relation, and they already have a kind of connection to the idea, and so Miles immediately is thrust in with his world's Captain America and dealing with that. But a lot of this is interspersed with what should be his origin. Kind of one of the few times that I'd argue, even if you're going to have some Marvel influences, the character should mostly be left alone to have their origin moment. And Miles never quite gets that. One might argue, like, if you look at the first couple of issues, it's pretty well self-contained. But the thing is he's initially bit and does not want to do anything. And when their universe's Peter dies, he becomes worried that he didn't do enough and that maybe he could have stepped in because he feels this connection, because obviously there's this spider connection. But but he attends the funeral, he does all this, like, he becomes invested. And that's interesting because already, I mean, that makes him a legacy character, but it's also a clean break between one character to the next. So getting a little bit of both ends of that. And I think that's really cool. But at the same time, by the time they get there, we're at, what, issue 6, issue 7. By the time a lot of that resolves, and he's starting to deal with his own thing where he decides to put on a suit, and for a while it's him being disrespectful by wearing exactly the spider suit, so he's granted one by Fury, and that seems weird, right? Like, initially he's brought in, but they're not sure, and there's still tension whether or not he should be doing this with Captain America, but Nick Fury's granted him a suit, and then Nick Fury, like, isn't there, appeared, isn't giving him mentorship or anything, which feels wildly irresponsible, by any measure. And it's interesting because he has a bit of a different power set. It feels like he has extra powers compared to Peter, but he lacks like the knowledge of how to make the web, at least initially, and whatnot. So I mean, there's supposed to be some trade-off, but it just feels like he gets some more spider powers where he can go slightly invisible, which makes, I mean, I know spiders have stealth and whatnot, but they don't do what he does, where he basically like cloaks completely, including his clothes, which that's one of those you have to let that slide for comics, because otherwise it's a different comic. Uh, and then he gets a venom blast so he can touch people and they get knocked out. That plays off. But his uncle is the prowler of their universe, and so he's kind of trying to take him on a path, and so there's this like push and pull between his real dad, who's trying to be on the straight and narrow, versus that, and so there's this push and play there, which is very Spider-Man. This, can't tell my family because they wouldn't understand. Taken to a different level, and taken to some places where, because the character, ain't a white dude, it makes some logical sense. I'd say logical. That's not the best way to say it. It makes thematic sense. I mean, that your mileage may vary with that, right? Like, I mean, that's the problem with talking about like minorities and what's right for them, is that at the end of the day, people are people. And these are people who live in New York versus anywhere else, and what you think is appropriate is probably going to be largely dependent on the specific people you know, and so but it's an interesting character arc. It fits, it makes sense, it gives something, and I think that's cool. But it's really hard to get past the decompression. Like I said, it's like I think the first arc ends around issue 14, which is around the time he's in his first crossover. But I mean, the initial action of everything that kind of needed to happen or be resolved or tabled for a later date, from before technically the first issue, because his first appearance takes place before Ultimate Comic Spider-Man #1, but in some ultimatum requiem nonsense, some weird title name. But I mean, everything that needs to be resolved and get him to be Spider-Man by things that are set up in the first issue that aren't ever... There's no ending in the first issue. By the time you get to any resolution, you're a year's worth of comics in. And I can sit down and I can read them all now, and that's fine. But they're super decompressed. They read like popcorn, and there's no meat on the bones. Like, every 2 to 3 issues feels like what needs to be in at least an issue. And again, reading it now, it's fine. It's a good story, but pages to story is thin. To a point that's painful, and that's been one of the main criticisms, and rightfully so, of a lot of Bendis' stories, is that he does this thing, and it's really hard when people really latched onto Miles Morales because they wanted this kind of a thing. There's a large body of people who wanted that, and God bless, I get it. But I feel like they wanted it so hard, they heralded this thing that, by all rights, when you pull it apart and when the story's done, it's good. But month to month being there in that moment, there wasn't that much there. Like, it's a new Spider-Man character, he's going through the motions, there's a few different twists. It is a different story, sure, but by the time we're done with the initial story and the initial setup of what you'd consider an origin, we're past a year. At that point, I mean, not for nothing, but to compare to the OG Spider-Man comics, a year in, here, let me look at this real quick. Live looking man. Yeah, so I mean, you have like the Fantastic Four Chameleon issue, you have Vulture, you have Dr. Octopus, you have Sand. I mean, like, you're going through a roster. I mean, Vulture again, sure. The Living Brain, Electro, like, Dr. Octopus again. Like, you'd set up a roster, and it was a different mode and a different time, sure, but like, at that point, like, there was a mythos established and a whole lot going on. And I think that's part of the problem with the huge decompression that you see is, by the time you're done with one story with this character, you really need to ramp it up so fast that it never gets a chance to breathe. He never gets a chance to have his own villains or much of his own side. And that's the thing, is whereas Bendis is moving along plot-wise, the character stuff is really cool. So, I mean, you have Miles' family, you have Genki, which is his best friend. He's accepted into this charter school, which is supposed to be this big tension point that he's allowed to at all, I think puts tension on, that side of New York idea. But maybe a little overplayed and almost to the point where it's like, maybe not having him there and having him in the crappy school where he's going to be forced to, maybe use his powers to get by just because the school's so rough, and if you have it, you got it, you gotta use it. Like, I think there's a lot to be said there, but we don't get that. We get this tension between school and family and Spider-Manning that's set up with these different camps, with him being immediately part of the Avengers and not him just doing it out of this pure sense of moral justice, but kind of because the world's going to crap because the Ultimate Universe is super weird. And it's hard to ignore that his crappy uncle with the Prowler drags him out to a lot of this initial stuff, and so much of what he's doing isn't superheroing, but essentially dealing with his family drama, which lessens the impact of him being Spider-Man, but is very much in the mode of modern comics where everything needs to be personal, which is unfortunate because without the body of things that are not so personal or doing stuff out of a sense of obligation, and then developing those ties with certain other characters like the villain roster a la Spider-Man that I pointed out, because eventually a lot of those became personal as they fought each other so many times, things started to intermingle. It's just is what it is there. It's the Prowler and the family connection and whatever mode it is for the Ultimate so far. I've only read into the teens. Curious to read some more, but initially it's interesting to see the character. I still feel like they pitched the character too young, but they play that as part of what's going on. I don't think that justifies it. And I think it's telling when Captain America makes a point that you can't do something too young. They even have the rejoinder of Iron Man saying, I remember someone else not being able to join the military at a certain point in doing it anyways. But Captain America's point of he's too young to serve, like if he wasn't allowed into the military, I think putting him on the streets like this is too young as well. And it's not even close, right? Like, he's barely out of being a toddler and doing all this. It adds this dark twinge that is supposed to be like this all age is like, oh, the adults are telling me not to do it, but I'm like, oh my god, no, it's like a 13-year-old going out doing this stuff. Like, that's wrong. And it's not like the Batman Robin thing back when they're doing stuff like they're putting him in dark situations, and it kind of undercuts like how scary that idea would be despite the powers. So I don't know. It balances this idea of like what would be realism and then violence, and then this idea of the real world if something's happened, quote unquote, right? But at the same time wants to live on this superhero fantasy, and I don't feel the story balances it well because it's so invested in the personal drama that it's not willing to take the angle of he's doing something he really shouldn't be, and that should be where most of the problems arise from. So I don't know. I'm partially doing this because people have been saying Miles is so great and whatnot, and he's definitely part of the mythos now, and I don't fully understand him. The best way to do that is just sit down and read, right? And I've been doing that. I find it interesting. It's really easy to go through these things because they are so decompressed, but you can feel the weight of that when you're realizing, like, I'm over a year in and barely anything's happened. It's just hard to look at these comics and understand the fervor around this character. Even Spider-Gwen, with those comics, developed a cast in a different universe entirely its own in, within a year you were in it. In this, we're still getting set up, and it's rough. Those character interactions need to happen faster, and man, I really wonder, I'm really curious to see how this works once some issues or some takes on Miles is out of Bendis's hands. Because I feel like, as much as it's great that they had the architect on it to help it along, they really needed to jet set this out to someone else if they wanted to get somewhere faster, because Bendis does not know how to move a story. And if you want to be setting up a new status quo in a metatextual sense of like, this is not Peter, this is our Spider-Man on this side of the bridge, you know, you gotta get some meat on those bones as soon as possible. And I think that really gives credence to this idea of what's been a debate lately and in different areas. And now this is several years old. Also, interestingly, most of these comics have the digital code things. I didn't realize they've been going on for so long. But the debate of kind of Marvel doing diversity for diversity's sake. Now, I'm sure we've heard both ends, right? You know, I mean, essentially, like, we need different characters and we need to diversify. I mean, we're getting to a world where, you know, you need to have more diverse characters, and frankly we're at a point where, you know, representation does matter somewhat. And yeah, we need more different characters. And then you hear the other side of saying, like, well, you know, these are the characters, this is what we showed up for, we're not getting that sucks. Also, there are all these other characters that could be used or have been used, and you're just ignoring that because it's not one of the big whatever. I can grant credence to both sides. I going to tend towards saying we do need more representation, but goddamn, seeing how they try to work in the big two is painful. I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. If you want to have representation and diversity, and you're not going to bring back old characters, which I think is totally valid, you know, sometimes there's a reason characters get left behind. They don't work now, even if they worked before, or trying to bring them back is just weird, and you're not going to capture what works. And so, you know, there's nothing wrong, and I think it should be a lot looser and easier to do new characters, even if they're similar to old ones. But that means a new character. This argument that we need to have a black Superman or the Mexican Spider-Man or whatever, I don't think holds a lot of great weight. I think you need to have different characters that are their own entity. If you make them derivative characters or secondary characters, or however you want to look at that, legacy characters, you've lessened the impact, because there's always going to be reverence for those who came before, and no matter how you look at it with superhero comics, that means there's always going to be the legacy and the callback to the white guy, and there's always going to be people, when they're on that title, on that thing, they want the white guy, which is understandable, because there's probably a lot of great stories, a la Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, Thor, Wolverine, whatever. Great characters that endured the test of time. I mean, that's the problem, is we're not talking about having a new Ragman spinoff, or even, I think, like, certain other characters it's worked better, like the Question or the Atom, where they were more secondary characters and they had their time, but bringing someone else worked better because the legacy of the character before wasn't as strong. But it's even better to just do the new character. Give them their own thing. No one's questioning Wonder Woman and why she isn't Wonder Man, right? Let the character be their own thing, and it will sing. And the problem with that, when looking at it, is most new characters, most comic stories, whatever, aren't that great. It's the law of averages. The great stuff is great, and people look to it, but most stuff, not so great. And that's just how it is. You're going to have to churn out 10, and hopefully one of them will last past 3 years. And we're seeing this push now. And now I think the other issue that we need to talk about is that people conflate success and reception purely with sales data. Sales data for comics is a joke. It's not representative. It doesn't really work. And when you're talking about diversity in other markets, to where people who aren't your stock standard white dude comic fan are going to be, are in those secondary markets, trades, digital, whatever. And so I think that's crazy to make that a barometer of success. I mean, clearly Miles, grab some people, but you can't argue the sales on Miles either. But maybe more so with a lot more of the recent stuff, female Thor, whatever, and there's been talks back and forth about what's sold well and what works and what doesn't, and da da da. If we want to be talking art, let's talk art, let's talk reception, let's talk opinion, that's all fine. If you want to talk purely financials, go talk to a stockholder, because that's not what I'm buying my monthly issues for. That's a ridiculous thing to talk about when you're talking about what's landing or not, because they've definitely pushed characters in the past to eventually become successes. They've canceled books that aren't so great because people don't like it, but they sold great. And we can look at some of the greatest selling comics of all time. Are you really going to tell me X-Men 1 or Spider-Man 1 from the 90s or God, Spawn, are the greatest comics ever created? Or are you going to tell me that they were just the best-selling comics ever? And yeah, they were probably all right, but no grand gems. Come on. So, I don't know, it's just been a bit of a push. I've been pushing through more Miles. If something really ticks me, I might do another video, but I can't imagine having a whole lot more to say. So, yeah, if you guys have been reading Miles or whatever, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Push it on. Keep on keeping on.